My name is Gabriel Garzoglio. I'm a cloud consultant with the professional services organization at Google. I'm here with my collaborators from Cardinal Health, Ed Hammond, Louis Verzi, and Walker Miller. The way we have structured our talk today is in 4 sections. We'll start talking about the challenges and best practices about application migrations. I'll tell you how PSO, the Professional Services Organization, can help you with application migration using a methodology called Cloud Sprints. I'll let you hear directly from Cardinal Health about their experience with Cloud Sprint or their use case. And then I'll come back and talk a bit more technically about what we do with you when we do a Cloud Sprint. When we start working with a customer to talk about application migrations, the first thing we do is assess the maturity of their infrastructure. And there are many ways to do this, but one way is really understanding how much cloud-ready they are. And so if you look on the y-axis, there is the on-prem amount of computation that the customer does versus how ready they are for public cloud. On the x-axis, you can actually see whether their operations are more classical sysadmin-oriented type of operations versus more cloud-native CI/CD-based DevOps operations. And of course, most customers want to be on the top right corner, where of course you have the productivity, you have the portability of the code, you pay for what you do. But what we often observe is that customers are actually on the lower right, actually lower left, where everything is more rigid and expensive. And so how can we PSO help you move towards the top right corner here? And of course, we work with you to understand how to integrate your CI/CD processes with GCP. And the other thing we do is also help you with lift and shifting your virtual machines or your servers from your on-prem environment into GCP. So as we do this, we observe that there are challenges that everybody faces during these migrations. And they're both business challenges as well as technical challenges. I mean, some of the things without going through the full list, right? But often we put together teams, and then we see that there aren't enough experts in a given area to actually do things hands-on on the cloud. Often there are decisions that need to be taken about the direction of the architecture, and there are maybe no decision makers available at that time to talk to. Some concerns about the flexibility of the design. Sometimes they are other concerns. The way we like to organize these activities is really as agile methodologies, where we do iterations of designs and implementations until we get to a point where you want to be. Some of the technical challenges is really about the lack of automation culture. I talked about helping you integrate CI/CD processes with our cloud. The closer you are to the right hand of the graph, the better it is. Sometimes there is the idea that we want to do everything all at once, and the boil the ocean type of activity, which goes together with the expectations mismatch on the left. And so, as a cloud consultant, my job is often saying, let's scope this carefully, make sure that we identify some good first mover, so that we can create an infrastructure for you and then migrate into this infrastructure a good application where you can start testing things and really popularize the work that you are doing with us. We structure the journey of a customer through our service offerings in these 4 different type of activities. We do assessment, we plan with you, we talk about how you can deploy and do the migration of your applications on the cloud. And once you are there, we can consult on how you can take best advantage of the cloud with some optimizations. So after you have done a lift and shift, you can start using your environment already, and then you can start using native cloud services. And this is a whole journey that if you want, PSO can help you with. And for this talk today, I'm going to talk more about the foundation, so how we design foundations for your environment in GCP to receive your applications, and then talk a bit about how to do the implementation. And throughout this journey, we keep in mind a few best practices that I can tell you about. The sooner you have a production quality foundational environment, the sooner you can start actually using your cloud for real. There is a lot of focus on our side to really automate the deployment of foundational elements and really designing them for your actual needs. In everything that we do, we always consider security first, from the first discussion we have until we get to the optimization phase, and really try to understand not only how to deploy the foundation in an automated fashion, but also how you can automate the deployment of your applications. As I mentioned before, we organize these activities in sprints, where we can actually do iterative design and implementation, so that every time you can get a feeling for how the infrastructure is going to work. And then I talked about, again, making sure that a first mover application, the one that you start moving into your application to popularize the work you're doing, is a good one. And so I'll focus a bit in this talk about the foundational aspect of things. And when I talk about foundational aspects, these are the things that I'm talking about. Again, selection of first mover, which is the important piece here. And then we want to do user identity, either through G Suite or cloud identity. Resource organization and access management go hand in hand. I'll talk more about this. How you decide to structure your organization has strong implications on how you want to implement policies on this hierarchy of resources. We always recommend using groups and roles to access resources. I'll talk more about that at the end. And then, of course, we spend a lot of time doing network design, so talk about the connectivity to on-prem or to another cloud, the topology of the network, and all the network services, DNS, and so on and so forth, BGP, etc. Security, again, we can work with you to understand your security objectives, and then understand how to implement proactive security controls, and then what we call reactive security controls, in the sense that we can have scanners that check your environment periodically and can fire up alarms when the configuration is not what you expected. Talking about the type of computing environment that are important for you, and then, of course, start talking about operations, because at the end of the day, you do your migration, but guess what? You're going to have to change somewhat your operations to make sure that you take best advantage of the cloud. Now, how do we do it in PSO? How can we help you with this? For application migrations, the typical approach that we take is offering you a consulting service called Cloud Sprint. And the Cloud Sprint is really a 1 week of intense work preceded by some preparation, where we work together. We do together a workshop for a full week, and we work elbow to elbow to design a foundational infrastructure and start working towards implementing this infrastructure with you, and then migrate maybe a couple of applications, 1 or 2 applications. We do this essentially with identifying the workloads, the good first mover, building the foundational elements, migrating the workload, and then understanding at the end of this week, once we are off, how can we keep helping you, or how can you take this and move it forward by yourself. We talk about GCP, and it's a chance for us to educate you and for us to learn from you on what you are doing in your infrastructure. Security, as I said, is always very important in everything we do. Select the first mover, and then really instantiate the production-ready cloud foundation and migrate the production workloads. When I say production-ready, I'm saying that all the elements of a production infrastructure is going to be available to you it may require still some work to tailor it to your specific needs. So for example, when you do auditing, we can integrate the GCP logs with your SIEM solution, whether you use Splunk or some other solution. But of course, the alarms that you want to trigger on are going to often be application specific. So then when you get to the point of configuring the new infrastructure to respond to your needs, then you can move it from production ready to actually production. This is a typical way we organize the sprints. They are meant to be very parallel in nature, and we start generally with this technical infrastructure kickoff, where we talk about GCP and we learn from you about your infrastructure. We spend most of the day doing design on the first day, elbow-to-elbow whiteboarding sessions. And then already on the first day, we sit together on your computers. We look at what we have decided to tackle first of the foundational elements, and then implement it in GCP with you. Always talk about security, and then split into multiple work streams, where each work streams tackle one of the foundational elements plus the application development. So the application deployment, so the actual migration of the workflow. If you look at the yellow lines, you will recognize the foundational elements that I was discussing before. One thing that is important to work well on this together is that there is a need to have enough people that are experts in these various areas in your business so that we can actually split. We'll bring enough people, enough engineers, enough consultants, but we need to be able to pair up. The last day is making an assessment of how well we did during the workshop, and in fact, how ready the infrastructure is for production activities. Every day, we take that ideal situation and we reassess it based on your needs. This is a real-life example of something that we did. And we agree on how to split in groups to actually accomplish at the end of the day what we want to do for your specific needs. And this is an example of the assessment that I was discussing before. You see the two columns, the workshop outcome and the production readiness column. How well we did during the workshop and how ready the infrastructure is by topic, which is typically the foundational elements that we have identified for your use case. One of the best ways we can be sure that we lower the percentage of errors in deploying the infrastructure is by automation. We have libraries of infrastructure as code that we share with you, and we work with you elbow to elbow to configure so that we can collaborate on the infrastructure as a code of your foundational infrastructure. Of course, the consistency is improved because you can check this stuff into Git and then avoid manual errors by doing peer reviews, typical debugging techniques that you can do now on code, and of course, enforce policies proactively. After this talk, around 4 o'clock, my colleague is going to talk about more details of this infrastructure that we have, the Cloud Foundation and automation. It's, I forgot exactly where, the hotel, the National Hotel. It's not in this building, it's one of the buildings outside. What I can show you is an example of what we do, for example, for provisioning projects. Creating a project is not everything you need to start. You need to then instantiate the computing environment that you want to use, enable billing, enable the APIs that you care, create the service accounts, IAM policies, and so on and so forth. And you can script all of this by using our templates. Now I want to give Ed a chance to talk about their experience with GCP.
Is this on? Yeah, OK. My name is Ed Hammond, and I'm with Cardinal Health. Cardinal Health is based in Columbus, Ohio, Dublin, Ohio, suburb of Columbus. And our mission is to make healthcare more efficient, for providers and for, in the end, trying to help our patients have better health care. So our cloud philosophy has been very simple. We want to enable Agile teams, development teams, to be very effective. Speed, agility, cost efficiency, those are all the great buzzwords. Traditionally, Cardinal Health has been a shared services, classic shared services model, where there are silos of specialists doing specific tasks, and we're trying to break down those walls and enable Agile teams to be self-sufficient. So they're able to quickly adapt and experiment with new technologies. The GCP project design, the notion of a GCP project, fits our model perfectly for doing that, because that helps us set up the security policies and everything for those Agile teams. The security by design, we started with building in the controls right up front. What you'll notice right in GCP is that the project is a unit of authorization, so you can set authorization controls at the project. So we have tight controls about how we create projects, but beyond that we delegate the controls to the app dev teams. The self-service and automation, as Gabrielle mentioned, you want to always provide tools, documentation, and consulting services. Rather than having a large shared services team, we want to have a small cloud expert team that can go around and help DevOps teams be sufficient, self-sufficient in the cloud. So we provide documentation. We have a wiki that has lots of documentation on it. We consult and help people build things. We have a number of colleagues in the audience that do that. But at the end of the day, we want our teams to be working on their own so that they can really experiment, test, learn, and grow. So how do we do this? One of the key things we learned early on was that the network is pretty key. So our design is basically to use two host projects, if you're familiar with shared VPCs and host projects, to use two host projects, one for production, one for non-production, and create shared VPCs under that. Then the project teams are using service projects that consumes those VPCs. We have tight controls over internet ingress and egress patterns. We're using various different security appliances and techniques for doing those kinds of things. But we worked very hard at setting that up front. So before the Cloud Sprint engagement with PSO, who did a great job, by the way, we had all this set up. It took us about 3 months working with our account team to learn how it all worked, because we went from zero knowledge to 3 months. We had it all built, ready to go, and we started going into the sprint. Our application teams manage their own projects. Again, typically they'll have one service project for production, one service project for non-production. And then we set up the IAM roles, custom IAM roles, at the organizational level. And we delegate that down and use service counts and AD groups. We map them over for owner and editor privileges when they need each one of the projects. The service counts for VPC firewall rules, that's really key to us. So that when you create an instance, it's using a service account, and that gives the authorization for that instance. We're also doing it for routing rules, so it can do the ingress-egress patterns, as well as for the VPC firewall rules for east, west, and north-south traffic. As Gabrielle mentioned, we always want to have everything scripted. So wherever something is well-known, well-understood, and repeatable, we try and do it in scripts. So when we built the networks, our project creation process is all scripted. Creating service counts and so forth, those are all scripts that we use. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Louis Verzi, who is a cloud evangelist.
So they let us make up our titles when we were doing this presentation. So I thought about what I do on a daily basis. And my official title is a senior engineer, but I feel like my job at Cardinal Health is really making sure everyone understands what the benefits of the cloud are and what they can achieve in the cloud. So that's where I came up with the Cloud Evangelist title. I want to tell you a little bit about our sprint engagement and how that experience was for us. And there's really two messages that I want to share with you that I want you to take from this. The first is to be ready, or be prepared going into your sprint engagement. And the second is to view the sprint really as taking you the last mile into your journey in the cloud. So obviously Google's going to meet you wherever you are in the process. So if you're on the first mile, don't feel like it's not time to engage. But for us, really, it was taking us the last mile really helped out a lot. So plan ahead, understand the technology, play around with the services. We had 4 to 5 engineers that were researching Google technologies in the 2 months leading up to our sprint, kind of talking about our culture, how the Google technologies, how we wanted the Google technologies to fit in, really how we wanted to design overall. And so by the time the PSO engineers came on site, we had a lot of our design complete. That allowed us to vet a lot of our designs and make sure that we were thinking about all the things that we should have been thinking about, that we weren't leaving anything out, that we weren't being stupid about some stuff. So it was really helpful for us. So I'd encourage you, if you're early on in the process, to do some research on VPC strategies, cloud identity, resource hierarchy, and custom roles. Those were some key areas that we understood where we wanted to be when the PSO folks showed up, so that we could make the most progress as possible. So being prepared allowed us to get into details like how to deploy and configure for SETI, building a billing showback model in Data Studio, defining our organizational policies. So it was still in alpha when we deployed, but organizational policies really allowed us to feel much more comfortable about giving out the keys to projects, because we could still put some controls in place, right? We could put a policy on saying no one can create a resource with public IP addresses, because I don't know about at your company, but our security folks aren't very keen on workloads that should be internal having public IP addresses. We're also able to integrate our organizational stack driver logs into Splunk. We also ran multiple work streams in parallel. So we had several conference rooms that were dedicated to the sprint engagement, and we had sub-teams that were breaking off. It was a lot of planned chaos for the week that they were on site with all the things that we had going on, but it was great to be able to make a lot of progress in a short period of time. That kind of gets us into one of the use cases. So we had 4 application teams that we were able to bring up on GCP during the week of our engagement that had never used Google Cloud Platform before. And like Ed was saying, we wanted self-service, we want automation, we want application teams to be able to do things themselves. So when those application teams, they had support. We were in the room, we had Google in the room, but our attempt was, which we were successful at, was giving the application teams the tools they needed to deploy their own resources, not to have us to deploy the resources, to have them script out their application installs so that they'd have repeatability. So one of those teams was our Splunk infrastructure team. So Cardinal's been in the cloud for a few years now. Our Splunk infrastructure was on another cloud platform. For many different reasons, we wanted to move that into Google. So during the sprint engagement, we moved our dev environment from another cloud provider that likes the color orange into GCP. We at the end of the sprint, they had built deployment manager scripts for their whole stack. They had migrated subsets of their data from over into GCP so that they knew what they were doing when they got to production. They were moving subsets of sample data. And really prepared themselves for a successful production migration the following month. So Splunk was the first production application we had running in GCP about a month after our engagement. It also laid the foundation for them to be able to explore an elastic environment. So in our prior cloud provider, there wasn't this concept of projects. There's accounts, but you can't easily manage hundreds or thousands of accounts. So it was a multi-tenant environment. People didn't have the ability to spin up their own resources, because if you gave them the ability to spin up and delete their resources, they could spin up and delete other people's resources too. Not a good thing. GCP allowed them to build an elastic infrastructure. So as they need to add resources, they can add resources. They don't need to engage the cloud team to add resources to their environment. They modify a script and execute it, and they have more indexers or more search heads. Like I said, since we could delegate more permissions, they're able to explore and improve upon their processes rather than be dependent on a centralized team to do everything for them. So that was our experience with the Google Sprint engagement, and really, like I said before, Google met us where we were at. So if you feel like you're not sure where to go, they can get you to where you need to go. If you feel like you've got a good plan, but you want a little bit of backup, make sure that someone that's done this before is making sure that you're not doing something stupid. It was great for us. It really was effective for Google to be able to meet us where we were at in our life cycle. I've engaged many vendors in my years in IT. And I do have to say that the Google professional services folks are far and away more experienced and more knowledgeable than any other vendor that I've brought professional services in for. So it was definitely an awesome experience for us. And with that, I'm going to turn some time over to Walker Miller, who's going to talk to you about our efforts with containers during the sprint.
Thanks. See if this will work. All right. So probably like a lot of enterprises out there, we got a go-forward strategy of utilizing kind of for in-house development, combination of PaaS and FaaS as kind of our first approach. But when you look at Cardinal's compute footprint, we're really only about 15% internally developed applications. We have about 85% common off-the-shelf software. And obviously, we can't do a lot with that as far as trying to determine, what we think might be a best practice for it. We have a limitation. What we've kind of identified is probably the biggest possibility for all that stuff is to move them into containers and Kubernetes. We see a lot of cost optimization and just a lot of benefits that you get from living in kind of a container world with consistency, speed, etc. Right? But as part of that, we have very limited experience when it comes to containers and Kubernetes. We've had some success in the PaaS world, but that's largely because they build the containers for you. And we don't have a team to really support or do any of that, so we get to kind of start from scratch. And so it was pretty easy for us to choose to kind of partner with Google very early on to help us kind of build that muscle. And so we brought them in for that first sprint, which was about a week long. We had a track that was 2 days, and we just said, let's get a container done, right? And that's what we started with, was just one. So we took kind of what we identified as some of our container-friendly partners. In our case, we focused in on IBM and their WebSphere stack, WebSphere Application Server, WebSphere Message Broker, and WebSphere MQ. are all things that work pretty well in the container world, and IBM has a good level of support for. So we weren't just kind of out on a limb on it. Nobody's too excited about using those technologies anymore, but they still exist for us, and they're not going to go away, unfortunately, anytime soon. So we took the first apps, and within 2 days, we were able to get one of each of those up and running. And again, we had one person from each of those teams internally working with Google, and none of them had done anything with containers before. So that sprint ended up being, as much as we could get done in 2 days, we did. We had a good idea for what the process would look like. However, you're only going to make so much progress in 2 days, so we brought Google back for an additional month to focus in on just the WebSphere application server stack, and our goal with that was to get 5 to 8 applications done, and we did. And really what we wanted to focus on was building a factory. So WebSphere applications are pretty cut and paste for the most part once you get it up and running, and we wanted that full-blown kind of pipeline that we could use to build our containers. And so Google came in, helped us out, and we were able to, by the end of that month long, we had a factory, we had 5 applications up and running, at least one of them fully tested, and more importantly, we had a pipeline. So since they've been there, we've actually gotten an additional 6 applications that are up and running, including our e-commerce application, which is our big bread and butter, right? So, and that's a full-blown WebSphere stack. I won't go into detail. So it was very, very, very successful for us. Yeah, that's it. I'm good. Back to you.
Thank you, Walker. All right, very good. So I wanted to spend the remaining time I have to talk a bit about the type of decisions you need to take when you go on implementing your automation for the provisioning of the foundational elements. Ed has talked a bit about their use cases on networking, and Luis has mentioned some of these elements. I wanted to spend a bit more time on these 4 on the board, the bold ones. So selection of the first mover, I mentioned that it's important. There are some business characteristics and some technical characteristics of a good first mover. If we talk about the business characteristics, you want something that is not really business critical for your first example, but on the other hand, it shouldn't be an edge case. You want to use this first mover as the way you go back to your executives saying, look, we have migrated X, and this is important to us. Let's make sure that now that we have migrated X, we can migrate everything else, and you get support because of the importance of X. You can actually then build a knowledge base out of this experience. And then, of course, it can afford the cutover window, et cetera, doesn't have compliance challenges, ideally. On the technical side, you want something that is really not very dependent on other services. As you start moving the application to the cloud, you don't want to have to take everything else that comes with it. Maybe it has less integration with GCP services, and so on and so forth. I mean, pictorially, if you look at a design diagram like this, maybe that box, the red box, may be a good first mover. Doesn't have a lot of dependencies with other things. Maybe can be deployed with CI/CD techniques, and maybe this one is not so good because of the way it depends on everything else. What we do, we go through diagrams like these with you, and we help you select what a good first mover is. Then resource organization and access management. Now, Luis was mentioning before that they were implementing security policies, for example, to prevent the provisioning of public IPs. Now, this is what you want to think about when you want to then implement security and access policies. The resource hierarchy allows you to do good separation of duties. It allows you to implement the access and security policies. Billing isolation is at the project levels. And then you can control quota and limits through this hierarchy. And generally what we recommend is, well, let's start thinking about the simplest infrastructure we can design for you. And this is actually a very simple one where you have projects, and then you put them together into folders that are environment specific. Now, each one of these nodes in this hierarchy is a place where you can actually implement access and security policies. So you can say, well, in the dev environment, I'm not going to have my developers provision public IPs, but maybe on production, I do need public IPs. And so you can change the policies that way. Now, this is simple, but in this example, for example, where do you place your shared services? And so then maybe you can think about something that is a bit more complex, where you maybe still retain the environment-oriented approach, but then you maybe have something that is shared services-oriented. And this is good. It's enabled the separation for shared services. It preserves your environment separation. But the drawback is that it's more complex than before, and maybe you need still something more complex because, for example, if you have multiple business units, where are you going to put them? And so we can go on in the discussion, and maybe you can add another layer. You can have at the top the business units, and you end up having something that is pretty granular for your access controls. It's easily extensible. You have a new business unit that you want on board. It's easy to do. It's a complex structure, so it comes with complexity, the fact that then you have to manage your groups or your roles very carefully, and also the network topology. If you have, say, one project that manages your network, then you want to be careful about how you give permissions to other folders in the structure and the projects inside those folders to get access to the network. So together, we generally all go through something like this, some discussion like this, and then decide which one is the best hierarchy for you. Together with the hierarchy, as I mentioned, goes access management. So how is access management implemented in Google? If you look at this diagram here, you have identities at the top. You have individual identities, robo identities, so service accounts, and then you have groups. Groups can be a collection of those two. These identities are granted a role, and the role is a set of permissions over resources. What we recommend always is that you give accesses to your resources, through role to your resources, from a group, because this way it's easier for you to manage the membership. If people come and go, you have a structure that is well thought out of. And to the zeros level, what we recommend is to start simply with maybe 4 organizational level groups. We have the org admin, defines the IAM policies. It can implement the structure that we have discussed before, can create projects, although eventually maybe this responsibility can be delegated. You have a network administrator group that has the responsibility for creating the network topology that then the rest of your environment is going to use. The network administrators in this picture maintain the firewall rules, and you can decide whether this function is something that the network administrators do or the security administrators do. That's part of the discussions that we're going to have. You have a security admin that, at a minimum, has visibility on all the resources, establishes the role, so the custom roles that Luis was talking about before, and then establishes the policies at the organizational nodes of the structure that we were discussing before. And then you have somebody that is responsible for setting up the billing accounts, monitoring the usage, granting access to using the billing accounts to project owners, and so on and so forth. So these are what we recommend as a minimum for organization level. And then, of course, there are folder and project level groups, and these actually change a lot depending on your business. You always have some kind of reliability engineer or some kind of DevOps operation where the developers develop in an environment and then collaborate with the reliability engineers to actually do the deployment through CI/CD. And then you might have some kind of data analyst figure that you want to create a group for. Now, for every one of these groups, we recommend a set of roles. And as I said, these roles are sets of permissions onto the resources. So in this example, I have only one example. You have the compute network admin that creates, modify, and delete networking resources, except for firewall rules and SSL certificates. And as I said before, you can decide whether to give that permission to the network administrators or your security administrators, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing that we also do start talking about operations. Once you have the foundational layout, you have your application in your new environment, you need to make sense of it. And operations has multiple facets. One thing that I thought I'd talk about with you is really the building and analytics. One thing that we always recommend is make sure that when you create your organization, you go to your account, billing account, and you export the logs to BigQuery. This allows you to do at least two things. One thing is you can use SQL syntax to query your billing information, and so you can start having insight in your billing information. And the other thing, you can deploy out of the box a Data Studio dashboard that can display information about your building, so that as you configure these dashboards, you can create automatically reports that maybe you can share with your CFO or with your VPs. Key to doing good building is really defining the labels that characterize your resources. So labels can be, for example, associated to cost centers, maybe to business units. When we PSO come on site with you, we have that discussion with you, right? How should we organize the labels to view your building? At a minimum, you have the granularity of the project level, but automatically things like Data Studio, this dashboard, can pick those labels and create reports for you. And the way to do it, there are instructions on how to do it, and we go together over these instructions and create a Data Studio dashboard for you. Now, these were the few things that I wanted to pick out of everything we do. In short, what we have discussed is that lift and shift is a good way, together with integrating your CI/CD processes, to modernize your IT infrastructure. PSO can help you with a methodology called Cloud Sprint. It's a 1 week of work. You have heard from Cardinal Health their experience using sprints and working with us. And then you want to automate everything that you do for creating your foundation and deploying your applications. And we discussed some of the concepts one needs to go through to really implement these concepts in infrastructure as code.